Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon, once again, when you're watching this webinar. Again, my name is Dave Nagel. Very excited to continue to share some concepts and ideas around an introduction to visible learning. This is webinar number 3, overview of effective feedback, and I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in. And we're going to talk about what it means to talk about how feedback can have a great impact on student learning, and the key is effective. And I want us to think for a minute, when in our lives have we received effective feedback? When in our lives, maybe if we received feedback that was ineffective. When we think about that, what I want to stress is I didn't say positive or negative. Feedback is effective if it increases our learning and our performance moving forward, and it's ineffective if it doesn't. And so we're going to dig into that just a little bit today as an overview, a couple of reads in the handout, and then we'll jump into a case study at the very end. So again, hopefully you've got your working handout with you, and I'm going to jump into our simple 1 point for success criteria for today. Hopefully you'll be able to articulate the 3 elements of the instructional model for feedback. There's going to be some other pieces I want to share, but that's really the main takeaway. And then we're going to talk a lot about this when we come together in just a few weeks here for our work together on November 28th and 28th and 29th. But effective feedback, Dylan William would say, doubles the speed of learning. And the reason why he says that is we know that the typical effect is, for all of Hattie's studies, is 0.4. Feedback comes in around 0.75, and I want to stress for a moment, while we hear collective teacher efficacy 1.57 and some other influences that have had a greater impact on student learning, one thing to consider is there's been more studies done around feedback, but that is the average. Now, no different than, for example, the gentlemen who are listening to this, we have an average lifespan of about 75, 76 years. That isn't going to increase necessarily or decrease necessarily a whole lot anytime soon, because that's the average of everybody who's lived. So feedback can have a tremendous impact on learning, way above 0.75. That's the average for all of them. And there's been so many studies that the needle might not move, but it also reminds us that sometimes that feedback, the influence of feedback, was well above 1. So 0.75, once again, is the average. And a lot of times as teachers, myself included, would say we give our students great feedback. But the bigger question is, what do they hear? The challenge that I always put on teachers, that I would put on myself, is, do we give feedback that increases our students' learning? And our answer choices are yes, no, or C. I don't know, because I haven't asked them. No different to the administrators might be watching. Do we have our teachers' effective feedback that increases their learning? Yes, no, or I haven't asked them. So we have to be careful about feedback given versus feedback received. You have a handout on page 8, if you would mind taking a moment and read through those 7 statements related to effective feedback. Please pause the recording for the moment. I'm going to come back. Please read those 7 statements and reflect on which of those research statements resonates the most with you. Please take a moment and pause the recording. I'm going to pause momentarily and then come back. But please pause the recording, read through those 7 statements, and reflect on which one is the most compelling to you. Welcome back. Hopefully you paused the recording and you didn't just wait for me to just come back in. But I love to do this activity with a larger group. Not an activity, but I've just pulled just these statements from some of Hattie's studies, and a couple of ones that I want to emphasize just for us to think about. That first one, feedback and instruction must be intertwined. Feedback has to drive what I do next instructionally, the task, the assignments, the things I do there. I want us to think a little bit around that number 4, that 80-20. It comes from Graham Nuttall's research, where 80% of the feedback students are receiving is from peers, and 80% of it was incorrect. What that isn't saying is that we need to stop these kids from giving each other feedback. Number 1, we can't. Number 2, we shouldn't. The more we have a success criteria, the more students can give each other feedback that's effective. But then also number 5, feedback is more effective when it's information on what's correct than incorrect. It's not that we're never going to tell students when something's wrong. But the more we can build on, that's what you're doing right, how could you replicate that? Not at all for their self-esteem, but for their learning. So we're going to dig into more of these, but hopefully you had a chance to think about some of those and maybe think in our own personal lives when they really make sense. The purpose of feedback is to do one thing, to close the gap. The gap starts with, where should I be? That's our success criteria. That's our end goal. How do I know where I am now? And then that feedback is what I need to do to close the gap. And students can receive feedback from 3 places. They can receive it from their teacher, from their peers, but most importantly from themselves. The more they can receive and use feedback to guide their own learning, the more they can help to close that gap, because they actually know what that gap is. The more we know what we're supposed to be learning, the more that we can close that gap. So when we talk about the instructional model of feedback, there's really three parts. Task feedback we provide learners when there's new information that is usually related to correct or incorrect. Now, I'm not trying to refute the research statement before. What I mean here is the first time students are learning phenotype and genotype, if they're getting it wrong, I got to fix that. If the first time they're confusing their consonants and their vowels, or their horizontal and vertical axis. Once there's some degree of proficiency or a history, then I want the learner to process where they are. You got the last three questions right. Why do you think you did this one wrong? It's a basketball coach. Why do we think we're getting beat back on defense? Notice that I'm asking a question. I kind of joke and say, as parents, we probably told our children at some point in time, if they're at a certain age, what were you thinking? That would convey that there's been some lessons and some guidelines that we've taught them that somehow or another got missed. We wouldn't tell a 5-year-old, what were you thinking when you touched the stove? Self-regulation, when there's a high degree of proficiency, we want the learner to regulate their learning. An example that I share is I'm about to give you a text that's maybe 3 or 4 Lexile levels above where you are. What pre-reading strategies do you think you're going to use? Notice what I did. I didn't say, here's a difficult text, I'd like you to reread it. I'd like you to read it and use these strategies. I wanted the learner to guide their own learning. The part of the instructional model that is not part, or the part of the feedback that is not part of an instructional model, is feedback about the self, usually in the form of praise. I'm going to walk you through just a couple examples, and maybe you're in the boat that I'll be in a few years when I start teaching my children to drive. But one of the things is, you can read this on the screen, you need to look both ways. It's not personal. That would be something that has to do with correct or incorrect behavior. I'm going to do it every time, and I'm going to be very clear and direct. It's good that you know that the left pedal stops the car. That's good. You slammed on the brakes. What else could you be thinking about next time when there's ice on the road? Notice I'm asking the learner, who has some degree of proficiency, to process. Last few times we've driven on the interstate, we had limited traffic. You could easily move in and out. We're about to go into rush hour. What should you be thinking about when you change lanes? We would never take a new driver and take them into rush hour traffic. What I didn't do was say, turn the radio off, get your hands at 10 and 2. I want the learner, the driver, to regulate their learning. That's not going to help Nick. It's not going to tell him what he needs to do next. So I like to show this example because it highlights in real life we apply these same types of strategies around feedback. Same concept in math. Chris, your horizontal x is right, but you're getting your vertical one wrong. I got to help you. Chris, the last time you created your plot, you did it correct. What do you think you're doing differently? Process feedback is almost always when it comes to error detection. Chris, you've nailed the graphing examples. How could you teach this to a new student, and what errors would you look for to know where to help them? Great job plotting the axis, Chris. Again, same concept in the classroom. Final point, when we talk about praise, praise is ineffective feedback for the product or the performance. That's why we have criteria. Praise for the effort, for the stick-with-itness, for the resilience. And a challenge for teachers, pretty interesting study from DeLuca and Summer that found in industrialized nations like the United States, we actually prefer praise. That's why we like to be liked on our Facebook page. So this is where we have to balance letting students know that what we think they're doing is good in terms of their effort, their resilience. But we can't say, good job on your math assignment. You've made 7 mistakes. Let's look at those. Good chance all the students are going to hear is good job. Also, as a footnote, a chance for students to give us feedback. And what you see here, this was just in a foreign language class, obviously, where chance for the teachers to get feedback from their students. And John Hetty talks about feedback as a way where you need to improve, and feed forward where you're already doing really well. Here's what I think you need to continue doing, and maybe a next step. Finally, you have a case study, similar to what you had with the visible learner, that I'm going to encourage you to just read through around a school-wide application of effective feedback, what they did to kind of monitor where they were in terms of the feedback they were providing their students. So again, please take a moment to read through that and reflect on the question at the very end. So again, our success criteria. By the end of this webinar, hopefully you can articulate those 3 elements of the instructional model of feedback: task, process, self-regulation. As always, I appreciate your time. I'm very excited to meet some of the new folks from Yelm that I haven't had the privilege yet to meet. I'm really excited, and always the gentlemen and ladies that I had a chance and pleasure and honor to work with last August. I'm really excited to see you in just a couple of weeks. So we have one more webinar coming up, and I will look forward to talking with everybody soon. Thanks, and have a great day.